Good evening. Welcome to Live United. Living United, where we have an opportunity to share, to learn, to look at how we can come together as a region, as communities, to protect and support all the people that live here who may be in need. Today I have the good fortune of having Dr. Marjorie Droppa with me. Marge is the director of Impact Monadnock. Very exciting initiative that's happening here in the Monadnock region. And we're fortunate to have you here today, Marge, to talk about some of the gaps that were identified early on in this process in relation to our children and their families. So I'm going to give you the floor right off here to share with the community a little bit more about Impact Monadnock. I know people are hearing about it, but it's always great for maybe people that haven't heard about it to know more about what's happening and why.
Thank you, Kelly. It's great to be here. So Impact Monadnock is a nonprofit organization. Monadnock United Way is a backbone partner with Impact Monadnock. And about a year ago, we launched an early childhood development initiative that actually is all about investing in our very youngest children, age birth to 5, and their families, to create overall well-being for the Monadnock region, no matter what age you are. So our brand is Start Small, Think Big. Start small with our youngest citizens and oftentimes, unfortunately, our most vulnerable citizens in the Monadnock region. Think big, think huge impact for the entire Monadnock region, because we've found from the research that by investing in your young children, you create well-being for all of us who live here. And in particular for our future workforce, which is such an important component of a thriving community in the 21st century. So today we were hoping to talk to you and the community about some great work that's been done by our community over these past 8 months. And that's a strategic plan to help develop the goals and strategies to create overall well-being in the region. And this strategic plan just got launched a few weeks ago, together with a gap analysis that we did. So today we were here to talk to you about this gap analysis, what we found when we hired consultants to go looking at the data in our region and compared it to state data. So it was interesting what we found, but we have a set of PowerPoint slides to help guide us through that process.
Before we launch into the gap analysis piece, why did this even start in the first place? Why did people think it was so important to start with our smallest and our youngest population?
That's a great question. So Monadnock United Way has a huge part to play in this. In 2012, as you know, Monadnock United Way, together with the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, did a region-wide needs assessment to see what are our biggest concerns, what are our largest social challenges in the region. And 3 challenges rose to the top. Child welfare, in particular child abuse and child neglect rates, were found to be higher in our part of the state than in many other parts of the state. The second is a lack of economic opportunity in our region, particularly around a livable wage. And then thirdly, the biggest challenge we're finding is educational attainment. So these 3 braided together after the research found that your single most compelling root cause of these 3 social challenges is a lack of investment in your youngest children. Because if we don't invest early when the brain is developing, then we're not investing in an adult that is able to manage 21st century career challenges and life challenges. So that's how we came to focus on our very young children through this needs assessment that started some years ago now.
And is very true, and I think the other thing that was really identified during that assessment process, you mentioned the root cause of it. When we think about things like educational attainment, what we were finding in the research is that our young people who are going into the workforce were not prepared and weren't proficient in math skills and writing and literacy. And there's a lot of research that shows that if we can address that at a very young age and prepare our young people, not just academically, but socially and emotionally, that it's critical to their well-being all the way through those academic years. So we oftentimes think people have to be proficient by the time they hit 10th or 11th or 12th grade because they're going into the workforce. But if they haven't developed those skills early on, it's very hard for them to attain that and reach it at that point. The other thing being that the brain develops till people are 25.
Yes, and I like to think that our brains are still developing, Kelly.
But they are, Marge, I can assure you.
But one thing that we also found through this needs assessment is that our community was very surprised by these findings. So we have the data, but part of our work has been to help the community understand this very important link between investing early and then how productive an adult is going to be. So I think advocating around this work has been a huge part of Impact Monadnock's role this past year, because a lot of our community tend to think, well, you know, a young child, how much can you teach them? And actually, as we're finding through the neuroscience, which has really come to the forefront of this research now, is that everything that happens from conception on is important to the development of how a baby is going to end up as an adult. So I'd love to, to talk about the neuroscience, and we have a lot of great stuff on our website. So if we don't get to it today, I urge everybody to visit our brand new website, impactmonadnock.org, because we have some great literature on there that can help show people that important link between investing early and creating the adults that we need to help our community thrive.
So let's take a look. I know we have some slides to present. Let's take a look at what you were finding that really led to the development of a strategic plan that we'll be talking about in another show. But I think it's important for people to hear, you know, these root causes aren't just plucked out of the air. We're able to see some very significant areas where we could work to and come together as a community, as a region, to really change this really complex issue. So Dave, if you want to pull up those slides, and I'm going to have you kind of walk us through this, Marge.
Sure. So as you can see from this first slide, and I love that we did this, but before we put a strategic plan together, we really wanted to make sure it was data informed. And what we're finding is that early childhood data is scarce at best. And what is out there is collected by a variety of agencies and departments in a variety of ways. So it's been tough to get this data. So what we have is basically what's out there currently. And we're working with Spark New Hampshire, which is the backbone together with Monadnock United Way for our initiative to try to create a better and more integrated early childhood data system. And I think that's a really important part of all of us in this field, that we work towards that. So as you can see...
Yeah, I was going to say we can see why here.
Yes, where are the gaps? So if we move to the next slide, it's important that we let people know, how many children do we have in the Monadnock region, age 0 to 5? And actually it's approximately 4,200. So it's actually quite a significant number. Some parts of our region have more growth in the 0 to 5 population. Stoddard actually is a great example of a town that's bursting at the seams with little ones. Others, though, overall are seeing more of a general trend in decline in young people. And that's not just in our part of the state. That's actually, unfortunately, a demographic trend that's uniform across New Hampshire. But as you can see from this chart, it's still a significant amount of our population. So once we found out how many kids we have, we identified the gaps using Spark New Hampshire's framework for public policy action to identify the gaps in our region. And the first gap we found is in the area of early childhood supports and services, and in particular in developmental screening, which is incredibly important for young children, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, and as well as the families' abilities in our region to access quality childcare, which is such an important part of the development of the young child's brain and their future success. So let's talk about developmental screening first. First of all, if we hold true to patterns across the state, about 61% of our children in the Monadnock region are not being screened regularly. Now, why is this a problem? Because developmental screening assesses whether a young child is reaching those milestones that they should be reaching in a particular year of life. If they're not reaching those goals, we need to know that, because then we can make sure they're getting the help that they need early. The later you leave it, the harder it is for a child to catch up, particularly if they're not reaching those very important developmental milestones.
So Marge, when you say milestones, what are you talking about?
Well, just to give you an example, so as we know from the neuroscience, reading to a child, no matter what age they are, is incredibly important for the development of a child's brain. So for example, if you were to hand a child a book and they weren't able to grab it or to respond with an animated face when you're looking at the pictures or reading the words to a young child, that would be something that might be of concern and that we should catch early and talk to a pediatrician about or to a child expert about. It can be simple things like knowing how to communicate with a child. Does a child respond to your voice? Does a child look at you when you're looking at them? That's called those serve and return relationships, where I talk to you, I bounce the ball over the net like in a tennis court, and that child is able to bounce that ball back in some animated way. So those serve and return relationships, no matter if it's with an adult or if it's in response to something that's happening, are really, really important milestones that a child needs to be achieving in those first 5 years of life.
So, and there's a lot of information about this, again, on your website that's available to people, both about the screenings, and people can access those screenings, so you can talk more about that. I think we can go back to the slides here and keep sharing this information.
What we do know is that low-income children in particular have higher rates of developmental delay. So for the children who are at risk, who are low income in our region, we need to make sure that we're really screening them regularly and purposefully. So if we look at the next slide, we can see that in tune with that is access to quality childcare. So Kelly, you've talked about how those agencies that are funded by Monadnock United Way, that are child care programs, all of them do developmental screening. And that's very important because among those populations, many of them are low income or at risk. So making sure that people have access to quality childcare where developmental screening, for example, is being done is incredibly important. But now look at these numbers here. 42% of our children in our region are not in a licensed child care facility. So where are they? Now, that doesn't mean that just because they're not in a licensed child care facility that they're in a place that's not great. I mean, there's some wonderful homeschool programs that are being done throughout the region. But the problem for us is that we just don't know where they are. Because if you're in a licensed child care facility, you're on a list. We know where to find you, and we know that your licensing is being checked, that you're applying for certain standards of care, and that those standards of care are being met. So we found that this was a big issue for us in the region, that we have children that we just don't know where they are. And then again, if you look at access, another issue was, if you look at the fact that we have one child care slot, one licensed child care slot for every 2.35 children in our region, that's actually a bit of an issue, because look at the state average. We have one child care slot across the state for every 1.75 kids. So there's need there, particularly among our 0 to 3 children. And there's the fact that we don't know where many of these children are.
So we have a service gap for a certain population here in the Monadnock region.
We do, compared to the state average, certainly.
And I want to bring it back to something that was mentioned in the previous slide, which was that children in low-income families run a higher risk. And I know that a lot of the research and the work that is going on is really demonstrating that when a family is experiencing toxic stress, the stress of maybe trying to make ends meet, not being able to put food on the table, not being able to access quality child care and have your child taken care of. All of these things create stress that then become very toxic for the child. And again, you have a lot of information about toxic stress, but it really points to the fact of why we have to really start small and be thinking big, because if we don't, these children carry that stress through their lives and it affects the brain development.
Yes, I mean, the neuroscience tells us now, and in the last 10 years, there's a lot of research about the effect of toxic stress on the brain, that toxic stress, which is this chronic, unrelenting stress that occurs day in and day out, can actually affect permanently the architecture of the developing brain. So that, neurons that should be connecting in the brain actually do not as a result of toxic stress. This can affect everything from ability to comprehend to ability to take care of oneself. So toxic stress is a huge issue. We know in Cheshire County that abuse and neglect rates are higher than all but 3 other counties in New Hampshire. So toxic stress is a huge issue, and access to quality child care is not only a relief to the child oftentimes, but also a relief to the family and can help with stress levels. So this is why we really honed in on access to quality childcare experiences in our gap analysis.
And I don't think we can emphasize enough how critical this is to the long-term educational attainment of people in our region, of their economic outlook and well-being in their future, and ultimately in terms of their very own welfare. So it becomes critical, and if we're ever going to break those cycles of poverty and really giving everybody the opportunity they well deserve, we have to do something at a very young age.
Absolutely, and we'll discuss this more when we talk about our strategic plan, but one thing I always like to say is that we looked at gap analysis data with always the view that we're being supportive of our families. So while we're identifying these gaps, we're also better able to say, well, how better can we support our families?
And I want to, again, highlight that you very much involve the community in this gap analysis, that this isn't done in isolation with a certain population or a certain group of people. This was really about the whole Monadnock region and how we can all come together to really be a partner in addressing this issue.
Yes, I always say that this initiative is for everybody, no matter what your income level, no matter what your background. We all need help. It doesn't matter who we are or where we come from. And that's why I stress the parent and family support piece. And I include foster parents, guardians, grandparents who are raising their children in all of this. I mean, you and I, Kelly, are both parents. Haven't you ever needed help? I know I certainly haven't. Continue to do so to this day with 3 teenage boys.
I was going to say, I don't know if that ever goes away, the fact that you need your neighbors, your friends, your family, all those people that surround you in life. And we have to remember that not everybody has all of those support systems or doesn't know where to turn for those support systems. And I think you're really trying to create an environment out there and a community culture that we all have a sense of responsibility for creating this well-being for our children and families ultimately.
Absolutely, and when I talk about to access to quality childcare, that doesn't mean that your child has to be in childcare. You know, we've got some great strategies that we'll talk about later that actually help the parent or the caregiver in the home. So it's not where it happens, it's how it's done. And that's what we're always looking is to plug those gaps.
So let's get back to our slides here because I want to make sure we have time to ultimately share all this good work that's gone on.
So moving on, you can see that our second focus area, as I mentioned earlier, is all about parent and family support. So how can we best support those adults who actually are the child's first teacher? So in particular, we looked at gaps around help for toxic stress. And toxic stress is a term that's come to the forefront lately, but basically it's this unrelenting stress that can alter the development of a child's brain. And one of the programs that can really help with that is home visiting. So what are the gaps around home visiting programs? And we'll talk a little bit more about that now. So if you look at toxic stress, there's a lot of factors that contribute to stress in the environment where you're raising a child. We've already talked about how child maltreatment is higher in Cheshire County than many other New Hampshire counties. But some other factors that contribute to stress are teen birth rate. And again, we have higher rates here in Cheshire County. We also have higher rates compared to the rest of the state in many cases in young adult drug and alcohol use. And then low educational attainment, and I think this is something that you referred to, Kelly, at the beginning of the show. But our students here generally score below the top 25% of the rest of the state in graduation rates, and equally important, lower in test scores for math and reading, and in particular around the second grade and fourth grade levels, which are huge markers for child development and problems therein. So moving on, one of the ways to address this, and this is all based on the evidence, so we looked at a ton of other communities, not just in New Hampshire, but other states in the US, about how are they addressing toxic stress. And one of the best ways is to do home visiting programs. And there's a lot of variety in home visiting, but essentially the core concept of home visiting is that when a child is born, there's early intervention for families where there's visiting from a professional who can help guide the family through raising a child in the best way possible. And it's done in a very friendly way. It's done in a very non-judgmental way. And there's been huge success, and the research shows this, with the more home visiting that you can get to a family, the better the outcomes. And there's outcomes across the board. So if you have good early intervention through home visiting and other supports and services, a child is more likely to graduate high school, a child is more likely to go to college, complete college in 4 years as opposed to longer, go out into the workforce and get a good job. So there's great reasons based on the research to invest in these types of programs.
And we'll come back to that when you actually talk about your strategic plan piece, because there's some challenges with the policies attached to some of these, both at the federal level and what we choose to invest in. And I do want to make sure we address that when we're talking about how we then approach really solving together some of these issues. So not losing sight of that. But we'll do that in our next show.
So let's look at the data that we found around home visiting. So as you can see, there is the number of people and families that we have in the Monadnock region. That's the large bar in the graph. And then you can see again that we have 4,200 children who are below the age of 5. And then you can see the amount of home visiting that's available to our families. And you can see that's a very small number. And then also important gap that we found is not only is there a small number of families, but the families who are getting home visiting only have very few visits. And we know from the data that the more visits you can have, the better the outcomes will be. So this is something that we identified as a gap in our region. Our third focus area is behavioral health. So looking at the social and emotional needs. And our key findings are that we have very few services to assist with our children aged 0 to 5, and very few of them focus on preventing toxic stress instances, for example, in the first place. So of our children who needed help with serious social and emotional challenges, last year only a third of them were able to get the help that they needed.
So we have three sort of topic areas that you've really discovered through this gap assessment. And in our next show, we will be sharing with the public what the community says we need to do to be able to address these issues. Any last thoughts? And please make sure you share the website with folks again.
Our gap analysis can be found at our new website, impactmonadnock.org, as well as an amazing community video of folks who worked on this plan, but also other folks who are explaining why we need to invest in our young children aged 0 to 5.
So, Marge, I want to thank you for being in this segment of the show. I'm looking forward to talking more about this with you in the next segment. And public, please join us next Wednesday for the second part of this series, talking about our early childhood and our families and children and how we can come together to make them thrive. I want to thank you for joining us tonight and remind you, please remember to live united by giving, volunteering, and advocating.